scientific classifications. This is fascinating. Can you talk about this? Because we've made medical research have to adhere to these arbitrary categories that government made up. I mean, this is just unbelievable. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So back in the early 90s, a bunch of women's groups got together and said, we don't like the way medical research is being done in this country because disproportionately it's being done on men. And men and women are actually physiologically different in a variety of ways. And it could turn out that if you're not getting a sufficient representation of women, you're not really finding out whether something's really safe and effective for women. And the reason that women were not being included in studies is because you're always concerned with whether if they're pregnant, there could be side effects, and they have their cycles that make, with hormonal cycles that make the time of the month more relevant for certain kinds of drugs. So it's easier just to deal with men. So they said, it's easier for the companies to deal with men. We want to make them deal with women too. Not completely unreasonable. At the last minute, when legislation along these lines was going through Congress, some African-American members of Congress said, you know what? A lot of these studies are being done primarily on white men. And we don't like that. There are historical reasons for that too. There's a lot of distrust of the medical establishment in the African American community. All the more reason to require them to reach out and include African Americans. Now, the problem with this is that for the most part, there's really no particular reason to think, unlike men and women, that there's significant physiological differences between what we call racial groups. But nevertheless, they start pushing for that. Eventually, Congress mandated the National Institutes of Health and the Federal Food and Drug Administration to require all researchers to get enough members of racial minority groups in their studies. They did not specify which groups. They just said, make sure you have racial minorities. So the FDA and NIH could have actually done something along the lines of get a bunch of scientists together, geneticists, anthropologists, whatever, and say, okay, if we are going to do this in a serious scientific way, what groups do we want to study, right? And there are and the groups that we might want to study don't necessarily match at all with the racial groups, right? There are several groups: Ashkenazic Jews, Icelanders, Hungarians, Gypsies, right? That have their own, that were sort of isolated from population either by religious restrictions or by geography, being islands and so forth. And we'll study it that way and make sure we have representatives. But two problems with that. First of all, there's so many little subgroups. What do you do? And secondly, if you want to imagine uproar, imagine the FDA actually getting people together, scientists together, to try to figure out which groups are really genetically different. So they just took the easiest, least common denominator way out and said, okay, we're just going to use these statistics that were made only for civil rights enforcement purposes, that specifically said they're not to be used for scientific or anthropological anything. And I said, we're going to use those. So now we have a situation where medical researchers who have any ties at all to federal government, which is most medical research, and all drugs that have to be approved, all medical devices have to be approved, have to make sure they have enough representatives of these different minority groups to satisfy the FDA, and it's just completely nuts. For example, take Hispanics. You have to have enough Hispanics. Putting aside the question of what enough means, and enough is, if you have a representative, something close to the representation of a population, that's probably enough. What racial group are Hispanics? What genetic differences do they have? It's like saying American. They're a multi-racial group. They're European. They're indigenous, and the indigenous groups have different subgroups. So Europeans have different subgroups within them. Not all Spaniards are the same. Basques are not the same as Catalonians in their genetic history, and so forth. They have Africa. There are people who are Hispanic or of Asian descent. There are a lot of people who have African ancestry. So it makes absolutely no scientific sense to say you have to have extra representation of Hispanic, except for this. People say, well, if you don't have enough Hispanics, then Hispanics are going to think that since it wasn't tested on them, it may not be safe and effective for them. But as I point out, whenever this issue comes up, and this is true for Black people and any other group as well, it's circular. The reason Hispanic people think that Hispanics need to be included is because the government has decided they need to be included. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. I am completely aware that Ashkenazi Jews have some diseases that we're much more susceptible to. I'm aware that we have certain genetic anomalies that are not common to other European populations. I don't worry about not being represented in, say, vaccine studies, because there's really no reason to, but I have more reason to worry than someone who's Hispanic, right? But I don't, because no one tells me to. So it's completely circular. unpopular, and it's absurd. And it costs lives. Moderna actually was forced by the head of NIH. Head of NIH said, I'm not going to endorse your vaccine unless you get more members of minority groups in your studies, and delayed their research by a few weeks. I don't know how many lives that cost, but for nothing, because there was no reason to think that vaccines would work differently. Why would mRNA work differently on a black person than on a white person? It was completely preposterous. And then you have these additional problems. Even if you thought that race was salient for medical research, which most scientists don't, the way we classify race, I gave you the Hispanic example, right? But the way we classify race has nothing to do with anything that would actually be genetically race. So Ethiopians, for example, or Somalians are closer genetically to Arabs and Jews and other sort of Middle Eastern originated groups than they are to sub-Saharan Africans. But we put them in the African category because that's how we classify anyone with black ancestry as African. Then people from South Asia are Caucasian, if you want to go by so-called race. They're not East. They're very different from East Indians, but they're all Asian. So you can have a study that has the requisite percentage of Asians, but you don't know if those Asians were Chinese or Filipino, who are mostly Austronesian anthropologically, or South Asian, who are Caucasian. So it's completely meaningless. But it's the government requires you to do it, and this has two really bad effects besides potentially delaying research. First, it's been inhibiting scientists from doing what they really should do, which was really look at actual genetics. Genetic tests are quick and cheap. Look for the genes that you're looking for. Try to find the genes that might differ among groups rather than looking at race. And the other thing that it does is that it gives this false sense of that we've actually tested things that we haven't. We don't know if you've tested it on black subjects, if you've tested it on Ethiopians or Somalians, if you're located in Minnesota and you go to the Somalian community to get your African American quota filled, it tells you nothing about West Africans who make up most of the American black population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I do have to say that I don't think actually the genetic distance from Ethiopians and Somalis is closer to Middle Easterners than West Africans. My friend Razib Khan does all these studies. He's done my genome, and yeah, you could do a chart. And I don't think it's, but your larger point is correct. These things are.
I'm not. I read that in respectable sources, but I am no geneticist, so
Yeah.
I will not go on. But yeah, I mean, but part of the problem is, so the third problem is that this is actually seeping down into medical. This has seeped down to medical care. So they'll ask you when you come to the hospital, or whatever, are you black or white or wherever you are, or if you're unconscious, they will just assume, and they actually will sometimes have different medical ways of different decisions of what drugs to give you or how to treat you if you have heart disease or whatever, basically a race. But there's very little scientific evidence for these things. But even if there was scientific evidence, so if you happen, there's a very interesting study where they actually asked people their race, and then they asked doctors to identify with the race, and not a single person of American Indian descent was correctly identified as American Indian. So you may have your protocols about how to deal with American Indians, and even if they're right, you're not doing it because you're not identifying the people that way when they come in unconscious.
Yeah, yeah, and the people who say they're American Indians, and don't look American Indian, I don't know how much American Indian ancestry they have on average. Yeah, this thing about the trust and sort of the scientific process. This reminds me of the other thing about the vaccine, where they would people would say, why don't they speed up the approval? And they would say, well, then people won't trust it, or there's some recommendation, and they would say, we can't tell people the exact truth because then they won't trust, or we can't everything makes sense about this, but we have to maintain trust in the process. And it seems like public health, what they were doing was they were doing this sort of pop psychology. They didn't have studies for their psychological assumptions. If we speed up the RNA vaccine, it will lead to anti-vax sentiment. That's one thing they would say. No studies, no research, said this. And it sounds like they were doing the exact same thing with the race stuff. They had a bureaucratic thing they wanted to do. They just wanted to make us, as little work as possible for themselves. And then they sort of made up an ad hoc sort of pop psychological, explanation of why that makes sense. And there was just no reason for it. I mean, isn't that what's going on here?
Sure. I mean, look, there's even if you thought that for some reason it was scientifically important to have all the minority groups included, the thing to have done would have been to proceed and say, but if you're worried, we haven't tested this in enough Hispanics. If you are worried about that, you could wait, but why deprive other people of it? But more generally, right? I mean, if you were someone like my elderly parents who have like heart conditions and that, who's especially vulnerable to COVID, your risk reward ratio is quite different than a healthy 20-year-old. And you might be saying, I'm willing, I don't need the full study, right? If you have preliminary results that say that this will protect me, I'm willing to go with that. Just give me the data, let me make up my own mind rather than, decide for me what you think is in the societal interest. But we see that, and, as people, when I've written about this, people pointed out, it wasn't the point I made originally, people pointed out to me, one of the oddities about the way they do this research is actually very similar to the diversity thing in higher education. So University of Michigan says we want diversity, but diversity is 13% African Americans, 8% Hispanics, and 1% American Indians, which happens to match the population of who applies to University of Michigan. But why would it be 13% for African Americans and 1% for American Indians if diversity was really the issue? Similarly, with vaccine trials or drug trials, if you thought that race had scientific, as we define it, has scientific salience, you want a statistically significant number of each group, not
That's
to
funny.
have them, not to have them match the population. It doesn't make sense to say we want to make sure American Indians are okay, so we'll test 1% of them. We want to make sure blacks are okay, so we make sure 14% of the subjects are black. It's just a randomly matching the population rather than any kind of scientific rationale at all. So this is especially disturbing to me, right? Because medicine is the one place, science is the one place where we hope for objective, non-politicized decision making, but the government's been encouraging politicized decision making, and it's been seeping down into the medical community, into medical journals, such that there is a strong movement that medicine should be racialized. That if we have a white patient and a black patient in the emergency room, that we should decide that the black person has suffered more indignities and difficulties in life, so to compensate for that, we should take the black person over the white person, which is horrific. I mean, the whole doctors should be sworn to treat. We require the Jewish doctor to treat the dying Nazi, right? The Hippocratic Oath is because doctors are supposed to be blind to anything except medical need. That even may be a little bit too extreme for me, that one, but nevertheless. But to start having doctors decide for political or sociological reasons, I think this patient is more important in some way. Now, you could look at things like, we want to do outreach for COVID vaccines, and we know people in the African American community are more skeptical, so we'll spend more money on outreach. That's okay. But to then say that we're going to give the vaccine to Africa, we're going to put them first in line. I mean, if you want to talk about the sort of thing, then the long term could cause racial hostility on a scale we haven't seen in this country for a long time, starting to prefer people based on their arbitrarily decided race by the government, who gets medical treatment and who doesn't, and allowing, I would refuse. I mean, if you told me my doctor was doing something like that, I would say this person isn't fit to be in the medical profession. I want him to see me as a patient. I don't even want him to ask me about my race. Do a genetic test. That's cool. See what genetic issues I have that might affect how a weight loss treatment works for me or how a cancer drug. But the fact that I'm white shouldn't really have anything to do with anything.